The first thing Clayton Mercer did after buying his 320 acres of high prairie was dig a hole. Not a well, not a root cellar, not a grave, though his neighbors would joke about all three before he finished. He dug a hole big enough to stable 6 horses, 30 feet long and 20 feet wide and 10 feet deep, carved into the side of the only hill on his property. "Mercer's lost his mind," announced Douglas Tate at the Stockmen's Association meeting in Cheyenne, where ranchers gathered monthly to discuss cattle prices and complain about the weather. Tate owned the largest spread in the territory, 12,000 acres of prime grazing land, and considered himself the authority on proper ranching. "Man's digging a cave for his horses like some kind of primitive. Next thing you know, he'll be living in a hole himself." The laughter that followed carried across the territory with the speed of good gossip. Within a week, every rancher from Laramie to Casper knew about the fool who was building an underground stable. Within a month, Mercer's hole had become a punchline, a shorthand for any idea too stupid to deserve serious consideration. Clayton Mercer heard the jokes and kept digging. He was 42 years old, a former cavalry sergeant who had spent 15 years in the saddle, keeping peace between settlers and tribes across the Western Territories. He'd seen things in those years that had taught him to trust observation over opinion, experience over expertise. And he'd observed something that the gentlemen ranchers in their fancy Cheyenne offices had never noticed. Horses died in Wyoming winters not from cold alone, but from wind that turned cold into murder. By October, his underground stable was complete. By January, every horse on the high prairie would wish its owner had been fool enough to dig a hole. Clayton Mercer had never planned to be a rancher. He'd planned to die in uniform, somewhere on the vast plains that stretched from Kansas to Montana, keeping order in a land that seemed determined to resist it. 20 years of service had seemed like a reasonable term, a career that would end with a pension and a small plot of land and the satisfaction of duty completed. Then came the winter of 1878 and the dull knife outbreak, and a decision that ended his military career, but began the rest of his life. The Northern Cheyenne had fled their reservation in Indian Territory, desperate to return to their homeland in Montana. The army had been ordered to stop them, to force them back to the disease-ridden, food-scarce land where they'd been confined. Mercer had been part of the pursuit, riding through autumn that turned to early winter, watching the Cheyenne families struggle north with their old people and their children and their horses. It was the horses that changed him. Not the politics, not the morality, not the arguments about treaties and justice that would fill books for generations afterward. The horses, the cavalry mounts, were well fed and regularly rested, rotated through a supply chain that kept them strong. The Cheyenne horses were half-starved and exhausted, carrying families who had nothing but what they could load on their animals' backs. Yet when the blizzard hit on October 23rd, it was the cavalry horses that died. Mercer had watched in confusion as army horses collapsed in the snow, while Cheyenne ponies, seemingly weaker and certainly less well-provisioned, survived the same storm. The difference, he eventually realized, was shelter. The Cheyenne knew how to find natural windbreaks, how to dig into hillsides, how to create protected spaces that blocked the wind that turned survivable cold into lethal exposure. The cavalry had camped in the open, trusting their superior equipment to protect animals that needed protection of a different kind. 14 Army horses died that night. The Cheyenne lost 2. Mercer resigned his commission 6 months later, the image of frozen horses burned into his memory. He used his savings to buy land in Wyoming, determined to raise horses that would survive what the territory's winters could deliver. And the first thing he did was start digging. The excavation took 3 months of brutal labor, working alone because hiring help would have required explaining his purpose to men who would have refused the work on principle. Mercer dug with pick and shovel, hauling dirt out of the growing hole in a wheelbarrow, building up the entrance ramp with each load removed from the interior. The hill he'd chosen was perfect for his purpose, a natural rise in the otherwise flat prairie, its south-facing slope offering protection from the north winds that made Wyoming winters deadly. The soil was a mix of clay and gravel that held its shape when excavated, requiring minimal shoring during construction. Water drained naturally toward the lower prairie, eliminating the flooding that would have made underground construction impossible. His neighbors watched the progress with amusement that gradually shifted toward concern. A man digging a hole was funny. A man digging a hole for 3 months was potentially dangerous. "You planning to live down there?" asked Samuel Whitmore, whose ranch bordered Mercer's property to the east. Whitmore had stopped by ostensibly to discuss fence lines, but actually to assess whether his new neighbor posed a threat to the community's reputation. "Because I've got to tell you, that's not how civilized people live. We left caves behind a long time ago." Mercer leaned on his shovel, sweat dripping despite the autumn chill. "It's for the horses," he said simply. "Underground stable. Wind can't reach them down there." "Wind?" Whitmore looked at the excavation, then at Mercer, then back at the excavation. "You're digging a cave because of wind? Horses handle wind fine. They've got hair, Mercer. That's what hair is for. Hair doesn't stop wind at 40 below. Nothing stops wind at 40 below except not being in it. Then build a proper barn. Walls, roof, door. That's how barns work. That's how barns have always worked. You don't need to dig a hole in the ground like some kind of badger." Mercer returned to his digging. "Barns have gaps. Wind finds gaps. Underground has no gaps. Underground is just earth, and earth doesn't have gaps." Whitmore rode away shaking his head, another story to tell at the Stockmen's Association, another reason to wonder about the strange cavalry veteran who seemed determined to embarrass himself in front of the entire territory. The stonework began in September, after the hole had reached its final dimensions. Mercer had collected rocks from across his property throughout the summer, hauling them by wagon to pile beside the excavation. Now he began laying them up as walls, creating a lining that would prevent the earthen sides from crumbling and would provide thermal mass that would moderate the underground temperature. The technique wasn't original. Mercer had seen it used by settlers in Minnesota, by farmers in Nebraska, by anyone who understood that earth-sheltered construction offered advantages that above-ground buildings couldn't match. But applying it to a horse stable was unusual enough to draw continued attention from neighbors who couldn't resist monitoring his progress. "Walls look good," admitted Thomas Brennan, a rancher whose spread lay west of Mercer's property. Brennan was more open-minded than most, having lost horses himself in previous winters. "I'll give you that much. But how do you expect to get horses down into a hole? They're not going to climb a ladder." Mercer pointed to the entrance ramp he'd been constructing, a gradual slope that descended from ground level to the stable floor. "Walk them down, same as walking them into any barn. Grade's gentle enough for a loaded wagon. Horse won't even notice the descent." Brennan walked the ramp, testing its grade with his own feet. "It's solid," he admitted. "Still, think you're crazy, but it's solid crazy. What about air? Horses need air. Underground means no air." Ventilation shaft, Mercer replied, pointing to a wooden frame he'd constructed at the hill's peak. Warm air rises, exits through the shaft, pulls fresh air in through the entrance. Same principle as a chimney. As long as there's temperature difference between inside and outside, air moves. The technical explanation impressed Brennan despite his skepticism. The man had clearly thought this through, had considered problems that most builders wouldn't anticipate until they became disasters. Maybe the underground stable was foolish, but it wasn't stupid. There was a difference that Brennan was beginning to appreciate. "Well," Brennan said finally, "I hope it works. God knows we lose enough horses to winter as it is. If your hole saves even one animal, it'll be worth all the jokes." "It'll save more than one," Mercer replied. "Wait and see." The ceiling beams went in during October. Massive timbers that Mercer had purchased from a sawmill in Laramie and hauled 70 miles across the prairie. Each beam was 12 inches thick and 20 feet long, strong enough to support the earth and sod that would cover the stable's roof. Installing them alone was the most dangerous work Mercer had attempted. Each beam weighed over 300 pounds, requiring a system of ropes and pulleys and levers that multiplied his strength, but also multiplied the consequences of any mistake. A falling beam could crush a man as easily as a falling tree, and there was no one to help if something went wrong. He worked carefully, methodically, accepting the slow pace that safety required. Each beam took a full day to position and secure, the process repeated 8 times until the ceiling was complete. The wooden frame created a grid that would distribute the weight of the earth above evenly across the stone walls below. Douglas Tate visited during the beam installation, unable to resist seeing the famous hole for himself. He arrived on a fine bay horse with silver-mounted tack, dressed in the tailored clothes of a successful businessman rather than the practical garments of a working rancher. "It's bigger than I expected," Tate admitted, standing at the edge of the excavation and looking down at Mercer struggling with a beam. "Stupid, but big. You could stable a dozen horses down there." "6 comfortably," Mercer replied without pausing his work. "8 in an emergency. More than that, and they don't have room to move, and horses that can't move get sick. Horses that live in caves probably get sick anyway. Dampness, darkness, bad air. A horse needs sky, Mercer. Needs to see the horizon. You're going to drive them mad keeping them underground. Horses don't care about horizons. They care about wind and cold and dying. Underground has none of those things." Tate watched a while longer, then mounted his fine horse and rode away without another word. His report at the next stockmen's meeting would emphasize the scale of Mercer's folly. Not just a hole, but an enormous hole. An engineering project that must have consumed every dollar the man possessed. "He'll be bankrupt by spring," Tate predicted. "If the winter doesn't kill his horses, the debt will. And then we'll buy his land for pennies and fill in that ridiculous hole." The assembled ranchers laughed and raised their glasses. It was always pleasant to anticipate another man's failure, especially a man who thought he knew better than everyone else. The roof took 2 more weeks, layer upon layer of timber and brush and sod that transformed the excavation from a hole in the ground to a feature that barely showed above the prairie. When Mercer finished, only the entrance ramp and the ventilation shaft indicated that anything unusual existed on this patch of rangeland. He led his horses down the ramp on November 1st, 6 animals that represented his entire investment in the ranching life. They were good horses, not the fancy breeding stock that wealthy ranchers imported from Kentucky, but solid working animals that had already survived one Wyoming winter in the inadequate lean-to that had served as temporary shelter. The horses hesitated at the ramp's entrance, suspicious of the descent into darkness. Mercer led them one at a time, speaking softly, letting each animal adjust to the strange new environment. The stone walls and earthen ceiling were different from any barn they'd known, but the hay in the mangers and the straw on the floor were familiar enough to provide comfort. "You'll be safe here," Mercer told them, running his hands along their necks as they settled into their new home. "Whatever comes, you'll be safe." He spent extra time with each horse that first week, helping them adjust to the underground environment. The mare he called Dusty was the most nervous, her ears swiveling at every unfamiliar echo off the stone walls. Mercer sat with her for hours, brushing her coat and speaking softly until she relaxed enough to eat without watching the shadows. The gelding named Sergeant, named for Mercer's own former rank, adapted fastest, seeming to understand that this strange underground space offered something valuable. Within 3 days, Sergeant was leading the other horses down the ramp without hesitation, as if he'd spent his entire life walking into hillsides. "Horses are smarter than people give them credit for," Mercer told Brennan during one of the rancher's increasingly frequent visits. "They know what keeps them safe. They don't care if it looks strange. They just know." This bond between Mercer and his animals became visible to anyone who visited the underground stable. The horses nickered when they heard his footsteps on the ramp. They pressed their noses against his chest when he entered their space. They trusted him in a way that went beyond simple feeding and care. They trusted him because he had proven himself trustworthy. The first snow fell on November 15th, a light dusting that melted by noon. The second snow came a week later, heavier but still manageable. The horses spent their days in the underground stable and their nights in the pasture, adjusting to a routine that kept them sheltered when weather threatened and free when conditions permitted. December brought harder cold, temperatures dropping below zero for the first time that season. Mercer monitored his underground stable carefully, measuring temperature with a thermometer he'd purchased in Cheyenne. The results confirmed what he'd hoped. While outside temperatures plunged to 15 below zero, the stable maintained a steady 38 degrees, cool but not cold, comfortable for horses that would have suffered badly in any above-ground structure. "How do you keep it so warm?" asked Brennan, who had stopped by to check on his neighbor and found himself genuinely curious about the underground operation. "No stove, that I can see. No heating at all." "Earth is warm," Mercer explained. 50 degrees year-round at this depth. The horses add their own heat. 6 horses produce as much warmth as a decent stove. Between the earth and the animals, the stable heats itself. "And cooling in summer?" "Same principle in reverse. Earth stays cool while air gets hot. The stable will be 50-something degrees in July while above-ground barns turn into ovens. Horses will be more comfortable in August than they are now." Brennan considered this, calculating implications that he hadn't previously considered. "You've really thought this through," he said finally. "I owe you an apology. I laughed with the others, called this Mercer's hole like everyone else. But you might be on to something." "Might be," Mercer agreed. "We'll know for certain when the real cold comes." The real cold came on January 9th, 1884, descending from Canada with the fury of a biblical plague. Temperatures dropped 40 degrees in 4 hours, the barometric pressure plummeting as if the sky itself was collapsing. Old-timers who remembered the blizzard of 72 recognized the signs and started praying. The storm that followed was the worst in Wyoming's recorded history. Wind exceeded 60 miles per hour for 3 consecutive days, driving snow horizontally across the prairie until drifts reached 15 feet against any obstacle in their path. The temperature bottomed out at 37 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes, cold enough to kill livestock by the hundreds. The killing started on the first night. Horses in above-ground barns pressed against walls seeking warmth, their body heat melting snow that refroze as ice that locked doors shut and sealed gaps that would have provided ventilation. Ranchers woke to the screams of animals suffocating in buildings that had become death traps. Douglas Tate lost 47 horses that night, nearly his entire herd. His state-of-the-art barn, built just 2 years earlier with lumber imported from Oregon, collapsed under the weight of wind-driven snow. The horses that survived the collapse didn't survive the cold that followed. Samuel Whitmore lost 32 horses. Thomas Brennan lost 18. Across the territory, the death toll mounted as the storm continued, day after day after day, until men began to wonder if spring would ever come again. Clayton Mercer lost nothing. His underground stable maintained its steady 38 degrees, while the world above descended into frozen chaos. The entrance ramp drifted over with snow, but the ventilation shaft kept air circulating, and Mercer had stored enough hay below ground to feed his horses for a month without accessing outside supplies. He spent the storm's 3 worst days underground with his animals, sleeping on hay bales and sharing their warmth, unable to reach his cabin through drifts that buried the prairie under an ocean of white. The horses were calm, unaware of the killing wind that howled somewhere above them, comfortable in a space that their owner's foresight had made safe. When the wind finally died on January 12th, Mercer dug his way out through a drift and surveyed a landscape transformed by devastation. The snow had sculpted the prairie into alien forms, burying fences and buildings and anything else that had dared to stand above the surface. His cabin was intact but invisible, a mound of white that gave no hint of human habitation. The silence was the worst part. After 3 days of howling wind, the sudden stillness felt like a held breath, like the world itself was waiting to see what had survived. Mercer could hear his own heartbeat in that silence, and the distant sound of a raven calling across the frozen wasteland. He spent 4 hours digging to his cabin, then 4 more clearing a path to the road that might eventually allow contact with neighbors. The work warmed him despite the cold, each shovelful of snow a reminder that he was alive to move it. His horses emerged that afternoon, blinking at the brilliant sunlight reflecting off the snow, confused by the changed landscape but healthy and strong. 6 animals, all 6 alive, while ranches across the territory counted their dead in dozens and hundreds. Dusty, the nervous mare, pressed her head against Mercer's chest as if thanking him. Sargent tossed his head and snorted, then trotted out onto the snow-covered prairie like he owned it. The other 4 followed, kicking up powder, celebrating their survival with the simple joy of movement that horses expressed better than any other creature. Mercer stood at the stable entrance and watched them play, tears freezing on his cheeks before they could fall. He had built this place, hoping to save them. He had hoped, but until this moment, he hadn't truly known. Now he knew. The news of Mercer's survival spread with the speed of desperation. As ranchers struggled to dig out from the blizzard and tally their losses, word passed that the crazy man with the underground stable had lost nothing. Nothing at all. 6 horses entered the hole. 6 horses emerged. Meanwhile, The territory had lost over 2,000 animals to a storm that no above-ground structure could withstand. Douglas Tate visited on January 20th, his fine clothes replaced by practical wool, and his arrogance replaced by something approaching humility. He'd lost not just horses, but his confidence, his certainty that he understood how to operate in this unforgiving land. "I want to see it," he said without preamble. "The stable. I want to see how it works." Mercer led him down the ramp without comment, letting the underground space speak for itself. Tate stood in the stone-lined chamber, feeling the warmth that had preserved 6 lives while his own barn had become a tomb for 47. "It's warmer than my house," Tate said finally. "How is it warmer than my house?" Mercer explained the principles. Earth, temperature, thermal mass, animal heat, ventilation flow. Concepts that seemed obvious now but had earned only mockery before the storm proved their worth. Tate listened with the intensity of a man whose survival depended on understanding. "I want to build one," Tate said. "Underground stable like this. Will you show me how?" "Yes. And I want to apologize. Called you a fool. Called this place Mercer's Hole. Made jokes at your expense all across the territory. I was wrong, dead wrong, and 47 horses paid for my arrogance." Mercer accepted the apology with a handshake. There was no satisfaction in being right when the cost of others being wrong was measured in dead animals and broken men. Only relief that his own horses had survived, and hope that the lesson might prevent future tragedies. The spring of 1884 brought reconstruction that transformed the territory's approach to horse husbandry. Mercer became a teacher, sharing the techniques of underground construction with any rancher willing to learn. The work was hard. Excavation required weeks of labor, and proper construction required skills that not every rancher possessed. But the memory of January's horror provided motivation that mere convenience never could. Thomas Brennan built the first copy of Mercer's design, completing his underground stable in time for the following winter. Samuel Whitmore followed, then a dozen others, then 24 more. The underground stables spread across Wyoming like a new religion, promising salvation from winters that had always demanded sacrifice. Douglas Tate built the largest underground stable in the territory, capable of holding 40 horses in conditions that maintained comfort through any storm. He funded the construction from the remains of his fortune, recognizing that protecting his investment in horseflesh was worth more than any above-ground barn that might fail when protection mattered most. "I spent $20,000 on a barn that collapsed in 3 days," Tate told the Stockmen's Association at their June meeting. Mercer spent maybe $200 on a hole in the ground that saved every animal inside. "We've been building wrong for generations, gentlemen. Building above ground because that's how buildings look. But horses don't care how buildings look. They care about living through winter." The association voted unanimously to recommend underground stable construction to all members, a reversal of sentiment that would have seemed impossible just 6 months earlier. The jokes about Mercer's Hole ended permanently, replaced by requests for consultation and offers of partnership. Regional agricultural surveys conducted in 1890 documented the transformation that Mercer had initiated. Of 156 horse ranches surveyed in Wyoming Territory, 89 had constructed underground stables or semi-buried barns incorporating Mercer's principles. Winter mortality for horses in underground facilities averaged 2.3% compared to 14.7% for horses in conventional above-ground barns. The economic implications extended beyond simple survival rates. Ranchers with underground stables spent 60% less on winter feed because horses in stable temperatures required fewer calories to maintain body heat. Veterinary costs dropped similarly, as horses protected from cold stress suffered fewer respiratory infections and colic episodes. The initial investment in excavation repaid itself within 3 years through reduced operating costs. Modern equine facility research conducted by the University of Wyoming in 1996 confirmed the thermal principles underlying Mercer's design. Studies documented that underground stables maintain temperatures between 35 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of external conditions, while above-ground barns in the same region experienced temperature swings of over 80 degrees between summer and winter extremes. The research also confirmed something that Mercer had understood intuitively. Horses evolved for conditions very different from the high plains of Wyoming, and protecting them from environmental extremes wasn't coddling, but simply good husbandry. Underground stables didn't make horses weak. They allowed horses to use their energy for health and growth, rather than simply fighting to survive. The technique spread beyond Wyoming, as ranchers from Montana, Colorado, and the Dakotas heard stories of the blizzard of '84 and the one stable that had saved every horse inside. Some traveled hundreds of miles to see Mercer's design firsthand, returning home with sketches and measurements and a new understanding of what was possible. By 1900, underground stables had become standard practice throughout the northern plains, as fundamental to horse ranching as fences and water tanks. The design evolved over time. Some builders added heating systems, others improved ventilation. Still others expanded the concept to include cattle and sheep, but the core principle remained unchanged. Earth protects what air cannot. Mercer's original underground stable remained in use until 1952, when his grandson finally filled it in to build a modern barn with electric heating and climate control. By then, the principles Mercer had pioneered were so thoroughly integrated into regional ranching practice that most people had forgotten they'd ever been controversial. The cavalry sergeant who had learned from watching Cheyenne ponies survive had never sought fame or credit. He'd simply wanted to keep his horses alive through winters that seemed determined to kill them. That he succeeded, and that his success transformed an industry, was almost accidental. The natural result of one man paying attention to what worked rather than what tradition dictated. Clayton Mercer died in 1911, at the age of 70, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had grown up taking underground stables for granted. His obituary in the Cheyenne newspaper noted his military service and his ranching success, but made no mention of the hole that had started it all. The Stockmen's Association erected a small monument at his grave in 1915, a stone marker that acknowledged what the obituary had missed. Clayton Mercer, it read, who taught us to build down instead of up, and saved 1,000 horses by saving 6. His horses knew, though, or at least their descendants did, generations of animals that lived and thrived in underground spaces that kept them safe from winds their ancestors had never needed to fear. Every spring, when Wyoming ranchers led their horses up from underground stables into the warming sun, they participated in a ritual that Mercer had begun, a ritual of protection, of foresight, of love for animals that depended on human wisdom for their survival. The underground stable that everyone laughed at hadn't just challenged Wyoming ranching assumptions. It had proven that dismissing unconventional ideas as foolishness often revealed not their ignorance but ours.